I never thought I'd become the kind of person who would plot an elaborate revenge scheme. I had always been the quiet one at work, the one who just wanted to clock in, do my job, and leave without any unnecessary drama. But life has a funny way of pushing you past your limits, especially when you're ignored, dismissed, and treated like your concerns don't matter. And when HR decided my voice wasn't worth hearing, I made it my mission to make sure HR itself became useless. It all started 3 years into my job at a mid-sized company that sold software solutions to corporate clients. I wasn't some high-powered executive or a manager with a team under me. I was just an analyst. My work was meticulous, detail-oriented, and often thankless. Most people barely noticed what I did, but my reports and evaluations were the backbone for several important business decisions. I liked the quiet stability of my role. But things changed when my new manager, Denise, took over my department. From the very first day, I could tell she had a personal dislike for me. I had no idea why. Maybe I reminded her of someone, or maybe she just hated anyone who didn't immediately worship her authority. She micromanaged me constantly, but not in a way that improved my work. She would give contradictory instructions, then criticize me no matter what I did. If I followed her written directions, she'd claim I wasn't being proactive. If I tried to show initiative, she'd say I was ignoring her authority. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone has bad bosses, right? I figured she'd eventually get bored and move on to tormenting someone else. But Denise wasn't content with just nitpicking my work. She escalated things. She started losing emails I'd sent her, and when I'd resend them with proof of the original timestamp, she'd act like I was being confrontational. She made jokes about my competence during team meetings, always with a fake smile plastered on her face, pretending it was harmless humor. My coworkers laughed awkwardly, but I could see some of them starting to believe her little jabs. The worst came when she started giving me impossible deadlines. She'd dump a last-minute request on my desk at 4:45 p.m. and expect it by 9 a.m. The next day, knowing full well it would take 20 hours of work. If I stayed late and got it done, she'd claim the quality wasn't good enough. If I missed the deadline, she'd send scathing emails to upper management about my lack of dedication. After months of this, I finally reached my breaking point. I documented everything. Every email, every contradictory instruction, every time she humiliated me in front of others. I compiled a thick folder of evidence, neatly organized with timestamps and witnesses where possible. I thought I was doing the right thing. HR is supposed to be the safeguard, the place employees can go when they're being mistreated. So, I scheduled a meeting with HR. I sat down with Karen, the HR manager, and carefully walked her through my documentation. I expected concern, maybe even sympathy. Instead, I got a polite but dismissive smile. "Well," she said, adjusting her glasses, "Denise is under a lot of pressure right now. You need to understand that managers sometimes have to be tough. It's not personal." I blinked at her, stunned. "But this is personal. She's sabotaging me. Look at these emails. Look at the contradictory instructions. She's setting me up to fail." Karen sighed like I was a child complaining about homework. "It sounds like there's just some communication issues between you two. I'll have a chat with her, but I wouldn't expect much to change unless you can find a way to adapt to her style. You know, be a little more flexible." I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd been slapped. HR wasn't going to help me. If anything, they just tipped Denise off that I had complained about her. And sure enough, the next week, Denise's behavior got worse. She started excluding me from meetings entirely, then blamed me when I wasn't up to date on projects. She began copying senior executives on every critical email, framing her complaints about me as concerns about my performance. My reputation was slowly being eroded, and no one seemed to notice or care. I went back to HR a second time, this time with even more evidence. And once again, I got the same infuriating response. "We don't see any formal policy violations here," Karen told me. "This just seems like a personality conflict. Try to work it out between yourselves." That was the moment something inside me snapped. If HR wasn't going to do its job, then I was going to make sure HR couldn't do its job. If they wanted to ignore me, I'd make it impossible for them to ignore the consequences. My plan didn't come to me all at once. It formed slowly, piece by piece, in the quiet hours after work when I replayed every unfair moment in my head. First, I kept documenting. But this time, I didn't just document Denise. I started quietly listening to my coworkers, too. People trusted me. I was the quiet one who didn't spread gossip. And when they vented about being mistreated, I asked careful questions. Did you save that email? Do you remember what day that meeting was? Little by little, I gathered stories. Not just about Denise, but about other managers, too. Instances of favoritism, harassment brushed under the rug, shady hiring practices. I realized pretty quickly that HR's main goal wasn't to protect employees. It was to protect the company, to keep complaints buried and lawsuits at bay. If that was their priority, then I needed to hit them where it hurt. Exposure. But I knew I couldn't just dump everything at once. If I wanted to make HR useless, I needed a strategy that would dismantle their credibility step by step. So I started small. I reached out anonymously to an external ethics hotline that our company had contracted. Normally, HR would filter these reports, but I submitted multiple detailed complaints about various incidents I'd gathered from coworkers, attaching documentation wherever possible. Suddenly, HR was forced to respond to higher-ups asking questions they couldn't easily bury. Next, I started quietly sharing information with my coworkers. Not gossip, just the truth. I showed them how my complaints had been dismissed, how HR had refused to act even with overwhelming evidence. People were shocked, but they weren't surprised. They'd had their own suspicions. And once the seed of distrust was planted, HR started to lose its authority. By the time Denise launched another round of attacks against me, the tide was beginning to turn. But I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first. HR still held their weekly open-door sessions, but fewer employees attended. People started rolling their eyes when Karen sent out her long-winded policy reminders. A few coworkers quietly confided in me that they didn't trust HR anymore. Not after what I had shown them. It was working. The credibility that HR clung to was starting to slip through their fingers, and I hadn't even made my biggest moves. Yet. But, of course, Denise wasn't going to let up. With HR standing firmly behind her, she thought she was untouchable. That arrogance would become her undoing. One morning, she stormed into the office and dropped a thick stack of files onto my desk. "I need this all entered, cross-referenced, and ready for client review by tomorrow morning," she snapped. I looked at the stack. It was at least a week's worth of work. I opened my mouth to protest, but she cut me off before I could speak. "And don't bother complaining to HR again. They already told me about your little visits." That sentence hit me like a knife. HR hadn't just ignored my complaints, they'd betrayed my confidentiality. I smiled tightly and said, "Of course, Denise." But inside, something crystallized. They had crossed the line from useless to dangerous. And now I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to dismantle them. I stayed late that night, not working on her ridiculous request, but working on my plan. The next phase was simple. Amplify the cracks. HR's entire existence depended on being the middleman between management and employees. If both sides stopped trusting them, their role would collapse. So I started planting seeds. With employees, it was easy. Over lunch breaks, I'd casually bring up how HR had betrayed my confidentiality, sharing the exact words Denise had thrown at me. People were horrified. "Wait, they told her you complained?" one coworker whispered, glancing around nervously. "So if I say something, she'll know it's me?" "Exactly," I replied, keeping my voice low. "They don't protect us. They protect management." The paranoia spread like wildfire. Suddenly, people stopped going to HR with their problems. They came to me instead, venting frustrations, seeking advice. I wasn't an official channel, but I listened, documented, and reminded them. Keep your records. Don't trust HR. With management, I took a different approach. I knew executives cared less about employee well-being and more about efficiency, reputation, and avoiding lawsuits. So I made sure they heard whispers of HR's failures. Whenever a project was delayed, because of unresolved conflicts, I quietly mentioned how HR brushed it off instead of mediating. When a good employee quit unexpectedly, I dropped comments like, "Yeah, they tried HR, but nothing was done." Always casual, always in passing, but always planting doubt. The beauty was that I wasn't lying. Everything I said was the truth. They just hadn't been paying attention before. Denise, meanwhile, kept digging her own grave. She berated me during meetings, dismissed my work, and mocked me in front of clients. But instead of shrinking under her abuse, I started baiting her. If she contradicted herself, I'd ask innocent, clarifying questions in front of others. "Oh, I thought you said yesterday that we should use the other data set. Did that change?" She'd stumble, trying to cover her inconsistency, and the team would exchange uneasy glances. If she made a snide remark, I'd smile and reply calmly, "Thank you for the feedback, Denise," in a way that highlighted her cruelty without me ever raising my voice. People noticed. They began to see what I had seen all along. Her behavior wasn't tough management. It was abuse. But here's the thing about corporate environments. People don't act unless they feel safe. They needed proof that standing up to Denise, and by extension HR, wouldn't destroy them. So I gave them that proof. One Friday, Denise berated me for nearly 10 minutes straight during a team meeting. She accused me of incompetence, laziness, and even implied I was sabotaging projects. The room was dead silent, my coworkers staring at the table, too afraid to intervene. When she finally stormed out, I calmly gathered my things, looked at the team, and said, "Well, I'll be filing this with HR again. Not that it will matter." The silence broke. A coworker laughed bitterly. Another muttered, "Yeah, HR's useless." Someone else added, "She shouldn't be allowed to talk to you like that." The dam had cracked. That weekend, I made my boldest move yet. I compiled all the evidence I had, not just Denise's abuse, but the broader pattern of HR negligence. Every ignored complaint, every confidentiality breach, every example of them siding with management at the expense of employees. And then, I drafted an anonymous letter. I didn't send it to HR, I sent it directly to the board of directors. The letter was detailed, professional, and backed up with dates and documents. I framed it not as a personal vendetta, but as a systemic issue. HR was failing in its duty, leaving the company exposed to lawsuits, bad press, and employee disengagement. I made sure to phrase it in the kind of language executives cared about. Risk management, liability, retention rates. I knew their priorities, and I knew exactly how to make HR look like the weakest link in the chain. Then I waited. The following week, chaos erupted. An emergency board meeting was called. Karen from HR looked pale and rattled, whispering frantically with her team in the hallway. Denise was called into closed-door meetings 3 days in a row. Rumors swirled, but no one knew the source of the storm. Meanwhile, I kept my head down, quietly doing my work, pretending to be oblivious. But behind the scenes, the shift was dramatic. Employees stopped going to HR entirely. Managers began bypassing them too, sending issues directly to higher-ups to avoid delays. HR's office, once a hub of constant activity, became eerily quiet. The few times I passed by, Karen sat at her desk looking stressed and overwhelmed. Denise's power began to wane too. Without HR running interference for her, her abuses stood out starkly. people no longer gave her the benefit of the doubt. When she lashed out, coworkers exchanged knowing looks. When she made impossible demands, people started pushing back, refusing to sacrifice their sanity for her games. And me? I became something unexpected, a quiet leader. Not officially, of course. I was still just an analyst. But people came to me for advice, for guidance, for reassurance. My cubicle became the unofficial HR department, the place where people actually felt heard. It was intoxicating in a way I hadn't anticipated. For so long, I'd felt powerless. Now, I was the one with influence. Not through a title or authority, but through trust. Still, I knew this was only the second act. HR wasn't completely destroyed yet. They still had resources, policies, and the ear of certain executives. If I wanted to make them truly useless, I needed to go one step further. I needed to show everyone, not just employees, not just management, but the entire company, that HR wasn't just negligent. They were a liability, and I knew exactly how to do it. The storm inside the company was building, but most people couldn't see where it was coming from. To them, HR simply looked incompetent, overwhelmed, and increasingly irrelevant. That was exactly what I wanted. But I knew that if I stopped there, HR might recover. They might regroup, hire some consultant, issue some meaningless training programs, and slowly rebuild their authority. No, that wasn't enough. I wanted to make them irreversibly useless. The key was exposure. Quiet whispers and private frustrations had weakened HR's credibility, but to fully destroy them, I needed to shine a spotlight on their failures, and that meant creating a situation they couldn't contain. I didn't have to look far. One of my coworkers, a woman named Elena, had been dealing with harassment from a client for months. The client would make jokes about her appearance during calls, send her inappropriate late-night emails, and even once tried to pressure her into meeting him for drinks alone. Elena had reported it to HR, twice. Both times, she was told, the same thing. We can't afford to lose this client. Just keep your interactions professional and document everything. In other words, HR had abandoned her. When Elena confided in me one afternoon, she was nearly in tears. "I feel trapped," she whispered. "If I push back too hard, I'll lose my job. If I stay quiet, I have to deal with him. HR doesn't care." I felt a familiar anger boiling up inside me. Denise's abuse was one thing, but this was worse. This was HR allowing harassment to continue just to protect a revenue stream, and it gave me exactly the leverage I needed. "Do you still have those emails?" I asked her. She nodded. "All of them." "Good," I said quietly. "Keep them. Safe. You might need them." Over the next week, I carefully encouraged Elena to keep documenting everything. I didn't push her into action she wasn't ready for, but I made sure she knew she wasn't alone. At the same time, I started drafting another letter. This one wasn't for the board. It was for the company's legal department. Unlike HR, the lawyers actually cared about liability because their jobs depended on preventing lawsuits. The letter outlined Elena's case in detail, backed up with her emails, and highlighted HR's refusal to intervene. I framed it in stark terms. This represents a significant legal risk for the company. Continued inaction could expose us to hostile work environment claims and reputational damage. I sent it anonymously, just like before. The effect was immediate. Legal launched an internal review. HR was caught completely off guard, scrambling to explain why they hadn't acted. Suddenly, Elena was being treated with kid gloves, her concerns taken seriously for the first time. The client who had harassed her was quietly reassigned, and a new zero-tolerance policy was hastily circulated to the staff. But the damage to HR's reputation was irreversible. Everyone knew they hadn't acted until legal forced their hand. The whispers grew louder. HR doesn't protect us. They only act when they're scared of lawsuits. And that was the truth. A truth no one could unsee anymore. Denise, of course, was furious. She suspected me, though she had no proof. Her behavior toward me became even more erratic. One moment, icy silence. The next, explosive rants. But now, instead of fearing her, I saw opportunity. Every outburst, every contradiction, every petty insult was fuel for the fire I was building. One day, during a team presentation, she cut me off mid-sentence and snapped, "You clearly don't understand the data, so let someone competent handle this." The room went dead quiet. I glanced at the slide, then calmly said, "Actually, Denise, this is the dataset you approved last week. If there's a problem, maybe we should revisit the instructions." A ripple went through the room. For the first time, people openly sided. With me. Denise's face turned red, and she fumbled through the rest of the meeting, visibly rattled. Later, 2 co-workers approached me privately. "You're right," one whispered. "She's losing it, and HR isn't doing a damn thing." That was when I realized something important. I wasn't just dismantling HR. I was replacing them. People had stopped seeing HR as a place to solve problems. They saw me. And if I wanted to cement HR's uselessness, I needed to formalize that role. So I created an anonymous group chat. I invited trusted coworkers and explained the rules. Share your concerns, document everything, and support each other. No gossip, no personal attacks, just facts and solidarity. The chat exploded with activity. Stories poured in, unfair promotions, ignored complaints, bullying managers. Patterns emerged, patterns HR had conveniently buried for years. And now, those stories weren't hidden. They were shared, validated, and remembered. I became the quiet curator, organizing the information, connecting people with similar experiences, helping them see they weren't alone. The more we shared, the less power HR had. Their monopoly on official channels was broken. Meanwhile, I kept feeding carefully selected information upward. Anonymous letters to legal, anonymous tips to the board. Always backed with documentation, always pointing out how HR had failed to act. Each time, HR was blindsided. Each time, their credibility eroded further. Karen from HR began to look like a ghost. She walked the halls with tight lips and nervous eyes, no longer the confident enforcer she had once been. Her emails grew desperate, filled with hollow reassurances about open communication and commitment to employee well-being. No one believed her anymore. Denise, too, was faltering. Without HR shielding her, she was exposed. Complaints about her behavior piled up, and though she tried to dismiss them, she no longer had an ally to sweep them under the rug. She was, in many ways, the living embodiment of HR's failure, and when she eventually fell, HR would fall with her. But I wasn't satisfied with just internal collapse. If I wanted HR to be truly useless, I had to make sure the company, and everyone in it, saw them as a liability, not a safeguard. That meant one final escalation, public exposure, not to the press, not yet. That would come later, if necessary, but to the employees themselves, to the very people HR claimed to protect. So I began drafting something new, a dossier, a collection of case studies, anonymized but detailed, showing exactly how HR had failed employees again and again. My case with Denise, Elena's harassment, dozens of smaller stories from the anonymous chat, each one carefully documented, each one showing the same pattern, HR ignoring problems until they exploded. When it was ready, I waited for the perfect moment. And that moment came during the company's annual town hall meeting. The town hall was supposed to be a feel-good event, executives giving speeches, employees asking pre-screened questions, HR reminding everyone about workplace culture. But, just as Karen began her bland presentation about employee trust and engagement, every inbox in the company lit up at once. My dossier had arrived. The moment the dossier hit everyone's inboxes, the entire company seemed to stop breathing. I had timed it perfectly. Just as Karen from HR was droning on about employee trust, people were glancing down at their phones, their expressions shifting from boredom to shock to outrage. Within minutes, the town hall descended into chaos. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as employees exchanged looks, holding up their screens to show each other what they were reading. The executives on stage shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something had gone very, very wrong. Karen froze mid-sentence, clearly realizing what had happened. Please, everyone, can we stay focused?" She stammered, but her words were drowned out by the rising buzz of voices. People weren't listening to her anymore. They were reading. They were remembering. They were connecting the dots. The Q&A portion of the meeting, which was usually a dull parade of softball questions, turned into a battlefield. One employee stood up and asked point-blank, "Karen, why does HR ignore repeated complaints until legal has to step in?" Another followed. "Why do employees have to protect themselves instead of being protected by you?" Karen's face went pale. She stuttered something about taking concerns seriously, but no one believed it. The trust was gone, and the dossier had made sure it could never return. I sat quietly near the back, pretending to be just another shocked employee. Inside, though, my heart was pounding. This was the moment I had been building toward, the moment HR's mask slipped for everyone to see. By the next morning, the company was in uproar. The dossier had spread beyond email. People were whispering about it in hallways, discussing it over lunch, forwarding it to friends in other departments. HR's office became a ghost town. No one went there. No one trusted them. Karen tried to do damage control, sending out a long email filled with corporate jargon about rebuilding trust and renewed commitment to employees. But it only made things worse. The more she spoke, the more people mocked her. Memes circulated in private chats, twisting her words into jokes. HR wasn't feared anymore. They were ridiculed. Denise, meanwhile, was unraveling. With the spotlight now shining on HR's failures, her behavior was front and center. Employees began openly challenging her in meetings, citing the dossier as proof that they didn't have to stay silent anymore. One brave coworker even said to her face, "We all know HR won't protect you anymore." I'll never forget the look on her face when she realized her shield was gone. For the first time, she looked afraid. Management scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency meetings were held. Consultants were brought in. Whispered rumors suggested the board was furious. Not at the employees, but at HR. They had trusted Karen and her team to keep things under control, and instead HR had become the source of the company's biggest internal scandal in years. Through it all, I kept my head down. I didn't gloat, didn't draw attention to myself. If anyone suspected me, they had no proof. I was just another employee navigating the chaos. But behind the scenes, I was watching every move, every crack widening in the structure I had, so carefully targeted. The anonymous chat I had started exploded in activity. People were sharing updates, encouraging each other, and, most importantly, supporting one another in ways HR never had. A shift had occurred. HR was no longer the go-to for problems. We were. Employees had built their own network, their own safety net, independent of HR, and that was the final nail in the coffin. HR wasn't just useless, they were irrelevant, but I wasn't finished yet. I knew that companies sometimes tried to salvage failed HR departments by firing a scapegoat. They'd cut Karen loose, bring in some shiny new HR director, roll out mandatory workshops, and pretend everything was fixed. I couldn't let that happen. If HR was going to be useless, it had to be useless permanently. So, I made sure the problem wasn't pinned on just one person. In my dossier, I had carefully included examples involving multiple HR reps, showing a pattern of failure across the entire department. And now, I encouraged others in the anonymous chat to share even more stories, especially those that involved different HR staff. The result was damning. It wasn't just Karen, it was the whole system. A system that had ignored, silenced, and failed employees for years. Replacing one person wouldn't solve it, and everyone knew it. Within weeks, HR had become a hollow shell. Executives stopped relying on them. Employees bypassed them entirely. Legal and direct manager-to-executive communication replaced their role. They were still technically employed, still drawing paychecks, but their influence was gone. They weren't protecting anyone. They weren't managing anything. They were just there. Denise, meanwhile, finally reached her breaking point. One morning, she stormed into the office, yelling at me in front of the entire team about a mistake in my report. Except it wasn't a mistake. It was her own oversight, documented in an email chain everyone had seen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply pulled up the email on the projector and said, "Actually, Denise, this is what you asked for." The room fell silent. Denise sputtered, trying to backpedal, but no one believed her anymore. By the end of the week, she was quietly reassigned to a different department, a clear demotion. Word spread quickly. Denise had finally lost her power, and just like that, my revenge was complete. HR had ignored me, betrayed me, and protected my abuser. In return, I had made them useless. Employees no longer trusted them. Management no longer relied on them. Their authority, their influence, their very purpose had been stripped away. But here's the funny part. I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. What I felt was relief. Relief that the balance of power had shifted. Relief that employees weren't alone anymore. Relief that HR could never again silence me, or anyone else, the way they had before. Yet part of me couldn't ignore the irony. I had become the thing HR was supposed to be, a place people went when they needed help, someone they trusted to listen, someone who actually acted. And maybe that was the real revenge. Not just making HR useless, but proving that they were never necessary in the first place. Still, as satisfying as it was, I knew the story wasn't over. Not for me, not for the company. Because once you realize how fragile these systems of power really are, you start to wonder, what else can be broken? What else can be remade? And I was more than ready to find out. Denise's quiet demotion should have felt like the ending. After all, she had been the thorn in my side for nearly 2 years. She had humiliated me, sabotaged me, and leaned on HR to protect her every step of the way. Now she sat in a different department, stripped of her authority, her name no longer inspiring fear but drawing whispers and smirks. That alone might have been enough for some people. But not for me. Because this wasn't just about Denise anymore. She had been the spark, yes, but the real enemy had always been HR, the department that had promised protection but had delivered betrayal. They had ignored me, exposed me, and dismissed me. And because of them, people like Denise thrived. Making HR useless had been satisfying. Watching their power evaporate, their office turn into a dead zone, their manager Karen pale and panicked. It was everything I had dreamed of. But now that they were broken, the company was faced with a question. What comes next? At first, executives seemed lost. HR had been the Band-Aid department for everything. Conflict resolution, policy enforcement, damage control. With them out of the picture, issues had to be handled directly, and managers quickly discovered they couldn't just shuffle problems off to Karen's desk anymore. It was awkward, messy, and sometimes chaotic, and that was exactly what I wanted. Because in that chaos, employees began to realize something important. We didn't need HR to protect us. We could protect each other. The anonymous chat I had started grew into something bigger. It became less of a place to vent and more of a network. People shared strategies for handling unfair treatment, pooled resources about workplace rights, even connected each other with lawyers or outside advocates when things escalated. We became our own version of HR. Except this one actually worked, managers noticed, too. Some resisted, clinging to the old power dynamics, but others adapted quickly. They realized that if they wanted to keep their teams motivated, they had to listen, to compromise, to address problems directly instead of hiding behind HR's empty policies. Slowly, the culture of the company began to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. I watched all of this from the sidelines, both proud and slightly amazed. I had set out for revenge, but I had accidentally sparked something bigger, a movement. Karen, of course, tried to claw back control. She scheduled mandatory HR listening sessions and sent out survey links with promises of anonymity. But no one participated. The few who did filled their responses with sarcasm and frustration. HR wasn't just distrusted anymore, they were irrelevant. Eventually, Karen resigned. Whether she was pushed out or left on her own, no one knew for sure. Her departure email was a long, corporate-sounding goodbye about new opportunities, but it was met with silence. No one cared. HR's collapse had made her a ghost long before she walked out the door. Other HR staff followed. One by one, they either quit or were reassigned until the department was reduced to a skeleton crew that handled nothing more than payroll logistics and vacation requests. The so-called people team was gone, and in their absence, something unexpected happened. I got noticed, not officially, not in a promotion kind of way. But people in every department began to treat me differently. They sought me out for advice, trusted my judgment, even asked me to sit in on meetings as a neutral presence. Without meaning to, I had become a kind of shadow HR, unofficial, unpaid, but far more effective. At first, I resisted. I didn't want the responsibility. I had spent so long fighting just to survive that the idea of being seen as a leader felt strange, almost dangerous. But eventually, I realized this was the natural outcome of what I'd started. If HR was useless, someone had to fill the void, and who better than the person who had dismantled them in the first place? So I leaned into it. Carefully, I continued to document everything, not just for protection, but to build systems. I showed people how to keep records, how to defend themselves with facts, how to create paper trails that management couldn't ignore. I encouraged people to support each other, to speak up together instead of suffering alone. The difference was night and day. Within months, employees were stronger, more united. Managers who had once relied on intimidation found themselves forced to adapt or risk losing entire teams. The company, ironically, became healthier without HR than it had ever been with them. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I no longer feared Denise. I no longer feared HR. I no longer feared being silenced, ignored, or betrayed, because I had built something stronger than all of them. Sometimes I wondered if I had gone too far. After all, HR had been destroyed, careers ruined, reputations shattered. But then I'd remember the way Denise had sneered at me, the way Karen had dismissed me, the way Elena had cried after being harassed and abandoned. And I'd think, no, this wasn't too far. This was justice. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I sat alone at my desk, reflecting on everything that had happened. 3 years ago, I had been just another quiet analyst, invisible and powerless. Now, I was the reason HR no longer existed in any meaningful way. I was the reason employees trusted each other instead of a broken system. And I realized something important. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about replacement, about tearing down what doesn't work so that something better can grow in its place. HR had ignored me. They had dismissed me. They had failed all of us. So I had made them useless. And in doing so, I had proven that we never needed them at all. As I packed up my bag and headed for the elevator, I couldn't help but smile. I hadn't just won, I'd changed the game entirely, and the best part? HR never even saw it coming.